Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Martin Gallagher. He's the author of a book, a very timely book called Terror for Profit. He's based in Linlithgow, Scotland, and he was actually a former police officer. At the end, being a superintendent with the Police of Scotland, and currently has his own consulting firm, Kilmailing Consulting Limited. He is a frequent commentator for the media on police issues, terrorism, and organized crime, and has experience in investigations and assorted security and media matters analysis and academic research. Today we'll be discussing the not only his book, but also the connections of the themes of the book and the latest pro-extremism uproar around the world, manifesting itself in part through Gaza protests, and I'll get to the use of that word shortly, in part, and also other forms of extremist forms of uprising and unrest, clashes with the police, that have become prominent in the West, have spread all over the world recently, and of course, the recent anti-Semitic attack on a synagogue in Manchester, which ended in death of the two people. These protests have, of course, also spread to Scotland as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, and of course, I'd like to start with a little bit of a curiosity over the use of the word protest with regards to the violent riots over Gaza, allegedly over Gaza, that we are seeing in many Western capitals and large urban centers. The reason I find it a bit strange is that the protests seem to take place regardless of policy and regardless of outcomes. For instance, with President Trump having proposed a peace plan that seems to at least have reached the stage of negotiations. It may still fall apart, but at the very least it's being seriously discussed. You would think that the people who are allegedly protesting are getting what they want, a potential for a long-term ceasefire at the very least and humanitarian relief for Gaza. But nevertheless, they seem to be protesting this plan as well. So is the word protest accurate regarding these mass public manifestations of outrage, or should we be calling them something else? And why is the media stuck on that particular term?
Okay, so I've obviously been speaking about this in other fora, so I've done a lot of reflection. Now, I think it's good to point out at this point that 20 years ago, so it was a wee while ago, I was a sergeant involved with policing the G8 summit. So that's in 2005. And I was a frontline police officer during that with a unit from the Metropolitan Police. So I was seconded to the Met, who were up in Scotland for the G8. Now, the reason I mention all that is that was possibly, and I would say probably actually, the last extreme left-wing violence that took place in the UK. Okay, and the reason I mention it is because I'm going to reference that into what you're talking about protests, right? Now, that was not considered to be protest at that time. That was seen as political violence, anarchy, political violence, very clearly seen as that. And in the UK, because that's where my expertise lies, we've moved during these 20 years away from the police being able to take very firm action in respect of that. I was involved in some pretty robust policing to contain that situation to where we are now. And there's a number of factors, and if you want to talk about them, we will. The other bit is another word that begins with P that I'd put in here as to why they're still protesting in inverted commas, even though things appear to be moving in the right direction. And that brings me straight to the book, because they are profiting from that activity. So I walked into Waverley train station in Edinburgh on Thursday night after the terrible atrocity had taken place in Manchester to an almost celebratory outburst of protest, if you want to call it that, in respect to the Palestinian cause. There was no respect whatsoever for the fellow British citizens who had died. Now, what I argue in my book, and I'm taking this to the extreme and applying this to others than terrorists, but those who function in terrorism and political violence, along with organised criminals, get more than financial profit from their actions. And what I mean by that is they get reputational enhancement amongst their peers, amongst their communities of interest. So by attending an incident like on Thursday night and these protests, they're getting rewarded for that. And actually the risk to them is incredibly low. Because let's be honest, standing chanting about a free Palestine in Waverley train station is not really going to change the mind of the Israeli government in respect of what it's doing about the Gaza flotilla, right? And everyone knows that. I know that as a patron of the train station. The protesters know that, standing in the train station with their flask of tea as they make their point. But who does it really affect? The poor Jewish people of Edinburgh who are having to experience this in their train station on the night members of their community have been killed a few hundred miles away. It's outrageous. And the authorities have withdrawn from policing this properly, in my opinion. That's my professional and personal. Sorry, I think that was a long answer.
It was a great answer, and that brings me right to the next question. Do you think the police is properly prepared for handling this protest? And by prepared, I don't just mean being able to use weapons when needed. I'm not just talking about the technical, tactical, operational procedures, although my question, of course, goes towards that as well. But do they have a conceptual understanding of who they're dealing with?
No. is the short answer to that. But that has been decades long in coming. Okay. And there are a whole host of reasons, some very peculiar to the UK, that are at play here. And again, some even more peculiar to Scotland. If you don't mind, I'll explain where I'm coming from here. So, back in the 90s, the UK took on the European Convention on Human Rights. Okay. Now, England had been quite a heavy legislation country up to that point anyway. But Scotland had not. Scotland had been a common law country. And the main charge that would have applied in that behaviour that occurred on Thursday night would have been a breach of the peace. Okay? So was a reasonable member of the public intimidated or threatened by the actions of that mob? Yes, they were, because I was. And I'm a reasonable member of the public. Now, so going back to the G8, and that's why it's a really good exemplar, right? The bombings happened in London on 7th of July, 2005. Don't know if you remember that. It's quite a long time ago, right?
Of course.
But that killed the protests that were taking place at the G8, okay? So we thought there was still going to be extreme left-wing activity with us losing resource to the bombings, okay? But that did not happen. The protesters packed up and went home. I was in Waverley train station 20 years ago speaking to extreme left-wing protesters who were nothing but respectful, even though I'd been fighting them hand to hand in fields as they tried to storm where President Bush was the day before. Nothing but respect. And I remember clearly a protester saying to me, the police have enough to do. So something has happened in those 20 years to change that attitude amongst the protesters, but also the police. 20 years ago, my police force was more than ready to robustly deal with anyone who could be seen to be disrupting the status quo that was required to be reinstated post those bombings. Okay, they needed a quick return to community cohesion, and there was sufficient resource and a will to use that resource at that time. That is not there anymore. And the European Convention of Human Rights has, in my humble opinion, had quite a lot to play in that, because we've moved away from the needs of society into the rights of the individual, and the pendulum has swung far too far.
Interestingly, since then, UK has had Labour governments, it has had Conservative governments, it has had Brexit, it has dealt with COVID, with assorted international events, and yet this issue of policing has never been re-examined in light of all these additional developments and controversies and political moves. And one would think that after Brexit, things would go back to the way they were, since that was actually one of the issues that caused the public to be dissatisfied with Brussels to begin with. So why hasn't it? Was it a betrayal of Brexit? Was it a lack of skill? Was it the fact that the promise was greater than the ability to implement it properly?
So the European Convention of Human Rights is separate to being part of the European Union. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
they're two separate things. And I think if you asked a normal member of the public,
Mm-hmm.
pre-Brexit, post-Brexit, they wouldn't understand that. They wouldn't get that they're two separate things, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right that when the decision was made for us to leave the European Union, that I'm not saying we should have left ECHR,
Mm-hmm.
European Convention on Human Rights, but it should have been under consideration. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, has very recently changed her position that she's now calling for an exit from the European Convention on Human Rights. Reform are calling for the exact same. Now, whether we leave the European Convention on Human Rights or not, right, it's 20 years now since the police were able to act in the manner that I'm talking about. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm retired, right? And I was young, I was fairly young at that stage. You know, there's not going to be anyone left that can remember how to revert things should we decide to do so. And it would be a really complicated process. I think it's what we need to do. I think that Scotland, in particular, is a country based on common law values, which worked for us, and we need to get back to that. But doing it is going to be incredibly difficult. But it plays into the situations that you talk about.
So that brings me back to the book that you wrote, Terror for Profit. What inspired it originally, and how did you manage to find the and examine the profit industry, given that financial trail can be hard to trace because these extremist groups tend to hide behind shell organizations, NGOs, corporations, and a labyrinth of assorted entities?
Yeah. So while I was still serving in the police, I undertook a master's degree at St Andrews University in terrorism studies. And my dissertation for that was on the links between terrorism and organised crime in Scotland. After I wrote my dissertation, it was published by Terrorism and Political Violence, the journal, and I got a lot of attention. And that inspired me to continue writing and ultimately led to a PhD by publication. So that's how I got my PhD. And because I kept writing more and more articles. And then I took that forward into the book. So that's where the book comes from. The book comes from my research into my articles that led to the PhD. In terms of identifying where profit comes from, I'll bring you back again to I'm not just talking about money, okay? I'm talking about profit in a far wider sense. And the book asks people to reconceptualize what profit is. And if I can take it to an example or a couple of examples, if that's okay, if you'll bear with me, right? First, in terms of organised crime, just to get where I'm coming from, and second, in respect to terrorism. So, in respect of organised crime, if you live in an area where organised crime flourishes, it's because you have a big man, for instance, at the top of the tree of an organised crime group. That individual, of course, wants to profit off of the criminal activities that they undertake in terms of finance. But I've worked with, I've investigated rather than worked with a lot of these individuals. They want to be able to walk into a pub and get their drink for nothing, and if the pub goes silent, and their word to count in that pub. They want to go into the shops and walk to the front of the queue. They want to be respected in the street for who they are. Right? That's profit. They're profiting from their position as the head of an organized crime group. Okay, taking it for a terrorist example, thinking of the people from the UK who went out to Syria, for instance. Okay, bought Islam for Dummies on the way to the airport bookshop. That shows you how well informed they were about Islam. These individuals perhaps have criminal convictions or similar in the UK, and they are profiting by going out to Syria to carry out acts that they see as giving them some form of perverse redemption. And there were even Islamic State recruitment posters that said, that the worst individuals can still have a future with ISIS. You can be redeemed. Okay, so they're profiting. Obviously, they were profiting from ISIS's crimes as well, but they're profiting in terms of their sense of self. This is into identity theory and such. That their self-esteem is perverse, right? I'm not saying it's good, but their perverse self-esteem is getting a boost from what they're doing, and that's where profit comes into. So there's that element which comes from one policing experience. Then I was using a lot of open source stuff round about, like Hezbollah's involvement with the drugs trade, Hamas's involvement with the drugs trade, the Islamic State's involvement with stolen antiquities and such, and that all features in the book. There's also very much the UK angle where you've got terrorism in Northern Ireland, both loyalist and Republican, is heavily involved in organised crime activity. Okay, so it's a whole picture of that. And what I do in the book is bring all that together. And I explain how lone wolves feature in that as well. Okay, I bring them into it and explain how it all actually fits together.
So that brings me to the next point, because, when most people, a few years ago, maybe even before 9/11, when people thought of terrorists, they thought of idealistic ideologues from the 1960s who were struggling for some cause and were willing to do just about anything to achieve it, even if it meant killing civilians and so forth. How has terrorism evolved from an entirely ideological enterprise into a business model? And what would you say are the structural incentives that sustain that transformation to today?
Right. So what has happened is, so go back 60s to 80s are really interesting for what we're going through now. Okay, so
Mhm.
before we move on to your question, if I can just point out, in David Rappaport's theory of terrorism, right, there's different waves of terrorism. So the 60s to the 80s were called the New Left wave. And during that, you'd extreme left wing terrorism, Bader Meinhof, Pyra, the Weathermen, but also that featured the PLO and that amalgamation, that support network between the two of them, anti-Israeli. Okay, so that's that phase, which I think we're maybe revisiting to a degree now. But getting into your actual question, what's happened since then, since we moved into the phase of the religious terrorism? That's how Rappaport phases it, with the high point being 9/11. Okay, 9/11 is the zenith of of Islamist terrorism. Since then, with a degradation. Okay, so the quality of the individuals who, in terms of their understanding of Islam and how tied they are to the cause, has degraded. Okay, so think of a wave coming down. Okay, you've got like the Glasgow airport bombers who, one was a doctor, one had a PhD. Then you've got Richard Reed, who's, a convert to Islam, who's a burglar, who's not very bright. And then you're coming into the real dregs, who are individuals who are just criminals that went out to Islamic State. And you've got lone wolves in amongst there who have very little understanding of what they're actually getting involved in. As that commitment to cause has come down, it's been far easier for individuals to get involved in crime. And the terrorism has become a veneer for criminal activity. And that resonates across into Northern Ireland. So I think terrorism does move in phases, and you can see parallels across different areas where terrorism is taking place. This degradation is a very common feature. Now, the question you ask about ideological commitment, that's my real concern of where we're going next. Because what we're seeing just now, I think, is a move into the fifth wave of terrorism, which looks like extreme left with the tie into the anti-Israeli piece again. The whole situation with the attack in Israel in October through to Gaza seems to be the fermenting piece for this. if we are moving into a very similar phase to the 60s to 80s, the extreme left wing terrorism, they were ideologically committed and worked in groups. They are very dangerous individuals, very, very dangerous individuals. And if we are revisiting that and do start to see an increase in ideological commitment and groups like Palestine Action move into terrorist activity rather than political violence activity, I think we're in for a world of pain. And I think that's a strong possibility that might happen.
Now, if you look at Palestine Action closely, and I have because
Mm-hmm.
the think tank I'm affiliated with actually published a groundbreaking report on the network around this organization of international hard left and even socialist organizations,
Yep.
you will see that there is obviously a financial pipeline that makes these organizations possible, which in turn
Yes.
ensnare and radicalize people who may have maybe never crossed the line of violence prior to joining in. Maybe they would have just tapped at the idea of just thinking about things or
Yes.
fantasizing or talking on
Yes.
social media. But these organizations prepare them and give them the skills, the confidence, and the networks, the sense of community to move forward with more aggressive and radical actions. So, have you noticed, looking at either Palestine Action or any similar organizations, are there any patterns in the financial lifelines that connect local acts of violence, like Elias Rodriguez in Washington, or any particular protest or rallies or events that these people organize to transnational extremist networks?
Well, I think the question you have to ask, right, and it comes back to profit again. Who profits from
Hmm.
these activities, right? And in the 60s to the 80s, it was the Soviet Union and their proxies. Okay. Now, there's no evidence yet, significant evidence yet, of Russian state involvement in this, right? You would not knock me over with a feather where that involved here, through cutouts and such. But what we have seen is Iranian involvement, and you've had that in Australia. So you had attacks on Jewish premises in Australia that the Australian government have unequivocally tied back to the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is working with Irish organised crime groups who are tied in with Republican terrorists. Okay, so this whole web exists of these individuals working together to come to Palestine Action. They're organised, they're networked. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Sunday Times reporting on the way that the cell structure had been,
Hmm.
put out to them and stuff. This is very concerning. Okay, very, very concerning. They carried out an action on a UK military base, but that was after a lot of attacks of a they would claim non-violent nature on business premises in the UK. To, who benefits from defence manufacturers and UK military sites being attacked? It's Britain's enemies. But no one's calling that out just now. You go back to the new left wave of the 60s to the 80s, the Soviet Union was at the back of training individuals, like Bader Meinhof and Pyra, and through Libya and such, providing them weapons. Do I think that could be happening now? Well, possibly. Is it something I would definitely consider it should be being looked at? Most assuredly. I don't know what your thoughts are on that yourself, but I in the book I talk about malign states and them being involved in this.
Actually brings me to a part of conversation I was going to revisit separately and later, but this is actually a perfect segue to it, which is, the interesting in the question of the Scottish Independence Party. Now, I'm not accusing them of being behind the protest, but what I do know for a fact is that they have ties both to Russian and Qatari funding. Qatar funded something to approximately £1 billion worth of alleged hospital building, and I don't think that hospital was necessarily worth as much as that sum that was contributed to the party. And Russia too has had assorted contributions. So I am wondering, whether the general state of unrest in Scotland has, in separatism and things like that, have been fomented by these entities and now being transformed into the streets
Right.
activity.
So living in Scotland, I would I would be very surprised if there was anything as sophisticated going on behind Scottish politics. Okay, it's just it might appear that way outside, right?
Hmm.
But I'm going to defend. I'm not political, right? And I'm not doing this in any way to make a political point, right? But I'm going to defend the Scottish National Party here, which I didn't think I'd be saying, right? But I do, I no, I just no, I'm not there that they have any connection to what we're talking, what we were talking about before. There is, the governing party here, John Swinney, their leader, whatever you think of his politics, strikes me as a thoroughly decent man. And
Hmm.
no, it's just that is stretching beyond the pale. I can't see. I get where you're coming from, right? Don't get me wrong. I do understand. The whole idea of a breakdown in community cohesion. Try to separate Scotland from the UK. I completely get how that might look like that, but actually living here and having lived here all my life, no, I they couldn't organise that. It's not that sophisticated a place. If you won't get this reference, right? But anyone listening to it from the UK will get it, right? There's a program called Father Ted, right, which is about priests on a wee island in Ireland. That's what Scottish politics is like to a degree. They're not capable of it. It's just not that sort of place. Sorry, it's just not.
So in that case, what do you think transpires? How do these state actors reach those people? If not through local political circles, how do they find each other? Is it social media? Is it local mosque infiltration? Is it, local leftist gatherings that they penetrate? Or is it something else?
So up to now, you can get a lot of open source information that the malign states have been targeting organised crime and
Hmm.
organised crime in cultures of their own. So, for instance, over New York, there was an attempt of a murder on an Iranian dissident, and that was through using, I think it was Azerbaijani organised criminals to carry out the attack, and it was through the Iranian state. Okay. Now, the links obviously are there culture wise for how they can reach out to them. The Iranians going through organised criminals to the Kinahan cartel. I don't know if you've heard of them. They have a relationship with them. And they had Kinahan cartel were hiding an assassin for the Iranian regime who tried to carry out an act in the Netherlands. So they use organised criminals as cutouts. And down in England, we had incidences where there was arson attacks on premises that were being used for Ukraine, for material for Ukraine, and that was through using criminals to carry out the action. So criminals are a way in. In terms of the leftist groups, there's not enough. There's no open source yet on how they're penetrating them. I would hope that the government are in about this. Unfortunately, though, going back to the 60s to the 80s piece, and I think this plays into what we're
Hmm.
talking about, right? The police had infiltrated a lot of these groups, okay, through using undercover officers. Excuse me. The tactics that they used were maybe quite well questionable. Excuse me. You had police officers undercover for years conducting sexual relationships with targets within these organizations and having children by them while using their pseudonym. And then they would disappear from the relationship with the woman. This scandal broke, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago now, and I think will have seriously compromised the police's ability to be infiltrating other leftist groups. Now, it would be arguable how extreme even some of the groups the police were infiltrating in the past were. Okay, that's there's groups there that you go, why were the police doing that? And that's a question you would need to ask the senior officers involved. I didn't in the slightest. But I think that will have affected what the police are doing now. So, the tactics that they're able to employ. Another thing is the deployment of undercover personnel has become incredibly difficult because of the internet, because of social media, and creating a legend for an individual is very, very difficult now. So that change will be perhaps affecting how able the police are to infiltrate organisations like Palestine Action and know, and get to your point, who's funding, who's directing, because this didn't come out of nowhere. right? They didn't appear overnight from thin air, and there's significant questions to be asked about who's at the back of this organization and similar organizations.
Now, interestingly enough, back in the day, organized crime in the US, old school gangsters, they used to be quite patriotic. As much as
Mm-hmm.
they committed acts of violence for their own benefit, they were anti-Nazi, anti-communist,
Yes,
and
yeah.
very occasionally employed by the FBI to carry out acts of sabotage against political enemies. So how did these organized crime groups become so cynical and so sociopathic that they're willing to sell out to the highest bidder?
So I'm not arguing that they are, and I talk about that in the book
Mhm.
because if I can be pejorative about it to Scotland, right? It's all very well selling explosives to someone who's going to blow something up in Africa, okay?
Mhm.
If you're an organized criminal, because it's not going to affect you. But if the
Mhm.
person's going to blow up Motherwell High Street and your granny might be shopping there, then you're not
Mhm.
going to sell them explosives, you know.
Mhm.
So that's
Mhm.
part of
Mhm.
the profit piece that you have to take into account distance, okay, and the risk to the organised criminals. So the Kinahan cartel, you know, in terms of working with the Iranians and those Azerbaijani organised criminals we spoke about, must have done some form of calculation that it was in their interest. They were going to profit, not necessarily financially, but profit from that relationship in some way that made it worthwhile to them. So I think there are a lot of factors that go on in organised crime calculations. I talk about this in the book. I outline what I think they are that would affect how they would behave and how they would operate with a malign state. They're not one thing to really get across about organised criminals. And I've dealt with a lot of them, right? Really high level baddies, right? Is they are not two dimensional cardboard cutouts. They are three dimensional people with a moral compass. It's just different to your and my moral compass. There's a really famous episode of The Sopranos, a couple of episodes of The Sopranos, which I think gets us right, you know, in fiction, where Tony Soprano learns that there are Arab organized criminals who also appear to be tied into terrorism. And he informs the FBI about these individuals, which would normally go against his code as part of the mafia, but he doesn't. Now, that's a fictional example, but in the book, I give a real example of where there was a 16-year-old boy was kidnapped and going to be murdered over a drug deal that had gone very bad, right? It involved 10 kilos of heroin. Organized criminals approached the police to tell us what was going on, which was completely out with how they would normally behave. But because they had a red line around their behaviour, and even they couldn't see an innocent 16-year-old get murdered for something that was nothing to do with them, you know? So there are red lines in there. A really good example, if you'll let me, I'll just finish this off, is that, to understand criminals is they have rules. That's why when there's a riot in a prison, sex offenders are targeted, okay? Because for organised criminal for criminals, sex offenders are beyond the pale. They're criminals as well, but the prisons don't like them because even though their rules are different, they still have rules about behaviour.
So speaking of rules, and this is where I'm a little bit, confused.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the movements that we are seeing are rooted in grievance and identity politics, but clearly this is not a very constructive approach to life to constantly complain that you're being exploited, even when life in the 21st century it's not so terrible in a Western country. It may be a little bit difficult here and now, but it's not like we're, having rations during World War II, where people
Yes.
put up with a lot bigger hardships, with a lot more uncertainty without complaining quite as much. So my question is, obviously, it benefits somebody to promote these narratives and to keep people complaining and unable to break free of their own mental state and invested in writing on the streets instead of trying to make the world a better place, including their own communities and you know and so forth. So, who and how who benefits from such a situation? Is it the politicians who need those sorts of voters for whatever reason? Is it other groups? Is it non-profit sector?
I think it's been a general change in society. And I
Hmm.
think you could go right back to Kennedy and take matters forward. So if you go back to Kennedy, right, and the height of American power in the early 60s, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So that was about the state and the country being of all import, not the individual. And we've gone from that to the other extreme that we're in now, that you talked about, individualism. We've gone from the collective being of the most import and your efforts to strive for the collective good to it's all about me, me, me. And I think that the social media and the internet, I'm not trying to be a tinfoil hat wearer here, right? But I think that the social media and the internet have an enormous role to play there, where they've given an opportunity for people to get their voice out there that they would never have had before, but also for individuals to be exposed to ideas that they would never have been exposed to before either. You know, Nine talks about this, the more and mobility revolutions, what's going on in society, about what's changed, about the access to ideas, not necessarily good ideas, and individualized it all. A really good example of where it's gone, and it's gone completely awry from 2016 is a guy called Ali Somboli. Have you ever heard of him?
Just very in passing, not
Okay,
familiar closely.
so he's quite important in my book because the lone wolf tsunami, the deluge of attacks started in 2016, and he often gets overlooked, right? And I think he's really important. So Ali Somboli was an Iranian extraction individual who grew up in Germany. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
his parents are Iranian. He grows up in Germany. Ali Somboli, troubled individual, bit of mental health difficulties, and he decides he's going to be a Nazi. Okay, right? He changes his profile picture to Anders Breivik, who carried out the Utoya Island attack, so a far right terrorist. And on the fifth anniversary of Breivik's attack, he summons individuals who are from an Eastern European background, kids from an Eastern European background, to a cafe in Munich and carries out a shooting attack on them. And when challenged by a white member of the public, he shouts to them that he is German. Right? Now, that attack was written off as not terrorism. But then when you can look at it through the prism of today, you can see that Ali Somboli picked to be a Nazi. Now, people just can't get their head round how can someone, of Ali Somboli's ethnicity choose to be a Nazi? Well, because we've individualized things so much that you can pick what you want to be. We have kids pretending to be cats. so he can pretend to be a Nazi. And there's other examples of individuals who pick these bizarre associations but individualize things, and we've allowed it to continue. This is a big point as well. Come back to the last 20 years, where no one is challenging these individuals who are coming out with these outlandish claims of who they are. I'm a cat and things like this, and saying, no, you're not. You're a human being. Get a grip of yourself. Right? And I think that plays in to all of this. However many genders we want to claim now exist. It's absolute nonsense, right? And we're basically encouraging this behavior, this ridiculous individualization, atomization of society, the exact antithesis of what Kennedy was talking about, and it's helping no one. Returning to your point, it's creating the situations that are causing these terrorist attacks.
It's very clearly that all these individuals to be pretending to be something they are not are very unhappy with the situation, but instead of changing it and working on making things better, they are looking for an escape. Like people who used to pretend to be superheroes, who used to go to the movies to watch superheroes, they want to pretend to be these other people they imagine to be having an easier life or a better life or more opportunities or more attention, and they want to get they want to get attention based on grievances rather than
It's
accomplishments.
the,
So
the
that's
same as the individuals that travelled to Syria to
mhm,
chop off people's heads. Right? They took it to the extreme, right?
mhm.
but think if you reflect on what you just said about these people who are not happy, they want a purpose, they create one for themselves. Well, they're at the exact extreme edge. The people who went to Syria, they're symptomatic of our age.
The thing is, pretending to be somebody else is not never going to make you happy because at the end of the day, you know you're not that person, and no matter
Yeah.
how you might try to get people to accept you. So in some ways, these people are suffering from a crisis of identity, from some sort of an imposter syndrome because they literally are fraudulent. And this, these Gaza protesters on the streets, the ones who are not born in Gaza or in any Middle Eastern countries, these people have no idea what life is actually like. So they're basically cosplaying and acting out on fantasies.
Okay.
And they're
So I would maybe right. So I'll come at a different angle there. Okay. So yes, they don't understand what life might be like there pre the October attacks into Israel. Okay. They might not have had a grip. They might not have a grip of what life's actually like under Hamas, particularly gay people. Right. They might not want to accept how they would have actually found life under Hamas. However, right, and this is a however, when you look at the devastation of Gaza, right, and I mean the
Mhm,
total devastation, I think
mhm,
we have to be fair and say that
mhm,
you don't need to have lived in a bomb site
sure.
to say I don't think
Mhm,
that that's very good, right? And but that doesn't mean in any way. So me saying that, right, is in no way meant to
mhm,
reduce the suffering that the people of Israel have gone under, right?
mhm,
I am in
mhm,
no way doing that. Okay, I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But what I'm saying is that I can understand why people are protesting about what's happening in Gaza without them having actually been to the Middle East, let alone been from there. I get it, because the footage that's coming out, it's extreme. It is extreme, Arena, of how how the military action has impacted. So I understand
mhm.
this, but I take your point that I'm not sure they exactly understand what they're protesting for. And I've seen the clips before of when someone's challenged about from the river to the sea. Do you actually know what you're saying, right? And they don't get it. It means the obliteration of Israel. So they don't understand that. They're not informed enough to get to understand the full part of what they're protesting about.
Now, here's a question, and I'm not sure whether it's even knowable whether this information exists. But how many of the people attending these protests are regulars, meaning people who attend all sorts of protests just because they're professional activists and they feel like protesting anything? And how many of them are specifically attached to this particular issue?
Right. So that comes back to a really important point in the UK that most of the people who used to be in Just Stop Oil are now
Mm-hmm,
involved with this. Are now involved with Palestine actions. Look at Greta Thunberg.
mm-hmm,
She's perhaps a perfect example of a protest tourist. Who's jumped from one cause to another because it's now the sexy topic in inverted commas in her circle of interest in her community that she wants to be seen to profit, with her virtue as to how she's behaving. And I think the statements, about the being kidnapped by the Israeli forces, that's outrageous. She didn't get a sandwich this time. I noticed that, but I mean, it's oh woe is me, and I think you have that core of extreme left protesters who are now becoming more and more aligned with the Palestinian cause. So they were aligned with ecological
mm-hmm,
um, matters before this, but this is what I was saying earlier. These are hardcore individuals, and as we move into, if it's similar to the 60s and 80s, could become very dangerous. Okay,
mm-hmm,
but round about them, I think you have people who are ill-informed. Okay, who don't really know what they're doing. They just want to be part of a protest because they're young and angry. And then you have people who genuinely care. Okay, who genuinely care about the people in Gaza, who understand the situation, and I think you've got to respect them. So out of them all, they're the ones that I respect that They've formed an opinion on this conflict, and they want to protest about it. And in a Western democracy, you've got to allow for that. I think that's an essential part of democracy.
Now, there is an argument to be made. There's been a clash of narratives over all this. Some people believe that this whole thing is part of some centralized funding plan by some actors at the top who are essentially pulling the strings and manipulating emotionally and otherwise assorted different interest group who end up carrying out the bidding, but essentially at the top, high above, there is one central authority or network coordinating all this, even if the people on the ground are not necessarily tightly connected to the other among themselves. The other perspective is that things are exactly what they are. This is a loose connection of radical networks and assorted overlapping interests who end up coordinating and, but are ultimately divergent. What do you think? It seems
So
to be the case.
I'll apply my policing eye to this, right? Now
Hmm.
remember, I was heavily involved with the GA 20 years ago, right? And the
Hmm.
extreme left wing organizations there, and the planning that went into counter them. And then I'm watching now the Palestinian protest movements and the extreme left people round about that. And they're very different. Okay. They're very different. Very, very different. Now, that might be technology's changed and the people have changed. Okay. I accept that. Time's marched on. I don't think so. I think that there is some form of coordination um, going on. I think that, coming back to your point about malign states, which I don't think affects the Scottish National Party. Let's get that very clearly in there, right? But the malign states, yeah. Could it be a possibility? Most definitely. If I was working in government, would I be looking for that? Yes, definitely. I'd be very concerned that that's going on, that there's that level of interference going on in Western nations.
What we saw in Manchester was particularly shocking because it had nothing to do with Israel's actions in Gaza whatsoever. It was an attack on a group praying during a um, religious gathering, and unless there's a claim that British citizens in a synagogue control Netanyahu and his coalition, which is absurd. Usually the claims are the other way around, that it's Netanyahu controlling everyone else, but not that random civilians can control a prime minister of another country. This was clearly an act of anti-Semitism motivated by nothing but fanatical Jew hatred.
Yes.
Obviously, we cannot generalize about the one individual because there are plenty of individual anti-Semites of all backgrounds. However, there has been a sense that this climate overall, this extremely charged climate and rhetoric and other incidents, they have been rising. And there's been a growing concern in the Jewish communities all over UK about something like that happening sooner or later. So what exactly, how is it that these anti-Semitic narratives have been adapted so easily alongside the humanitarian concerns about the status in Gaza? Why is it there's no one raising the questions? Wait a second, this has nothing to do with that military situation. These are British citizens. Why are we talking about this?
Well, I agree with you, and because we corresponded just very briefly before I came on. 18 months ago, I finished my book and could see this
Hmm.
was coming. So the conclusion of the book says, I think it says something along the lines of, if I was still in the counter-terrorism sphere, this is where I'd be applying my eye, is to the extreme left, and there's going to be attacks against Israeli-linked communities. And I apply that to the Jewish community in general. I would, right? Because because of the way countries like the UK are constructed, right? For rightly or wrongly, the Jewish community is seen, perceived as maybe the better way to describe it, is in some way linked to Israel. It is. The same as a West Coast Catholic in Scotland is perceived as linked to Ireland, right? My family's not lived in Ireland for over 125 years, but
Mhm.
I'm still seen as linked to
Mhm.
Ireland. So did you get the distinction
It's
I'm
a
making there?
sort of a
Yeah.
tribalist, clannish perception.
Yes, yeah, it's
Mhm.
just the way it is. It's just the way people perceive things. Um, but this was you could see this coming, and I wrote articles about this. Had trouble getting some published, right? Because people just didn't want to touch it, and I
Mhm.
think it's because we go back to the whole what's happened in the last 20 years. Certainly in British politics, there's been a drift to the left in British politics, away from the centre ground. Certainly not, certainly not been the right. Even though we're a conservative government for so long, politics in Britain have drifted to the left. And if the politics in general have drifted to the left, the extreme left is more tolerable. Okay.
Mhm.
So you've had various things in society. You could put EDI into this bracket as being over on this side of politics. Do you agree with it or not, right? It is, right? It's on the left side of politics, okay? And because you've had all these things become the norm, then it's been far harder to tackle this rise in extreme left, oblique, anti-Israeli narratives. I saw people the other day talking about this and linking it to the far right in the British media, the attack. And you think, whoa, excuse me. Now, I know that the far right have had issues with the Jewish community in the past, right? And I'm not claiming they don't, but it's been patently obvious for years in Britain that anti-Semitic matters are a much bigger issue for the extreme left than they are for the extreme right. That's been obvious for a long, long time to anyone. Huh?
In the US, it's a little different because some of the far right figures have now become openly, first of all, connected to foreign states. We're talking about the Tucker and Candace Owens variety, and we've had some dual, like the Tate brothers, American British, bizarre, truly bizarre individuals. And then we have a whole ecosystem of these influencers online and offline who are you know, who are actually economically quite liberal if you look at them. I would actually describe them economically being on the left. They're not traditional conservatives by any stretch of the imagination, but they identify as far right. And there's been a sharp rise in both rhetoric and other, anti-Semitic manifestations with those groups, especially with the younger people here. But I haven't seen quite the same level of correlation in other countries, and in the UK. I think in the US seems to be driving that phenomenon much more openly than it is. It might catch up elsewhere as well. For now, it seems to be that the far left in UK is more active, and certainly more empowered. Um,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good description. That's a good descriptor for it. Yeah.
But that leads me to the question, many fault specifically Starmer for mishandling this whole situation from day one. I'm not sure that Starmer alone is responsible because people before him clearly did not get to the roots of the problem when it started going in that direction. And while the war in Gaza for the last 2 years has certainly fed into the situation, there's been problems even preceding that, and there's been groups of Islamists who have opened centers all around London and in other locations. You've had political party members, you've had the Corbyn faction, and all of these issues are not brand new, and they didn't start with Starmer. Starmer, I don't think is helping. I'm not sure that he even knows how to help. And then there's this whole thing of calling for a state of Palestine without any conditions of responsibility as a state. At the very least, holding them to the same account as one would hold any other new entity. Um,
Yeah.
so the question is, what is going on here? To what extent is this a policing problem? To what extent is this a political problem? To what extent is it a social problem?
Very good question. Um, so the protests are definitely in the immediacy a policing problem, right? And 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 this cannot go on, right? Policing in the UK is not structured in a manner to continue to deal with this. So we don't have a gendarmerie, to deal with public order. Generally, what you're doing is you're sooking away normal police, resources to deal with these protests, and that's not sustainable, right? So something's got to give in a policing sense, right? Either the police approach has to change, okay, which is going to be difficult after 20 years of closing cells and changing how the criminal justice process works, right? And not having enough prison places. So there's that side. On the political side, I don't think asking people nicely not to protest is the way to go, right? It's terribly British, right? It's terribly British. It doesn't work, right? It's just as the way to describe it. It's terribly British. We could get Father Ted back in. Maybe he could negotiate, right? But it's like we have to come up with something better. Okay, we can't just. Could you please stop doing that? Like the Roman centurion in Monty Python. When the people are getting crucified. That's awfully bad. Don't do that. That we can't go on like that. We have to make a decision how we're going to deal with this. And the UK's got all sorts of dynamics round about, ethnicity, religion, and people's politics. And that's that. And the newspapers are speculating on how much of an influence that has. I hope that's not at the forefront of those making decisions. I really do. I hope they're looking after the best interests of society as opposed to their polling numbers. And in terms of society, my own thought is integration is the way to go. Right? We have to get far better at social integration. Right? We cannot continue with the situation we've got where we've got hundreds of thousands of individuals coming to the UK to live, and there's no stipulations round about how we integrate them into UK society. Now, the UK's absorbed big populations before, not on this scale. It's it's such a rapid pace, but we have done it. But we need to have the space to have these conversations. I was speaking with someone from the Pakistani community in Scotland, and they're very established, right? And I think it would surprise. I don't know if you been to Scotland.
Yes, I have. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, it is, yes. So the Pakistani community that arrived here in the 1950s, right, is incredibly well established. So that the guys wear kilts to formal booze. They speak with a broad Scottish accent. They drink iron brew. They're the exact same as me with my Irish heritage, right? They're Scottish, but they're getting new communities coming in imposed on them. And people see, well, it's the Muslim community. No, it's not fair, right? You've got an established Muslim community, and you've got Muslim communities who've arrived since. Lumping everyone together is not right. But no one wants to have these conversations, And I was speaking to my friend from that community who said, I don't have any way of articulating this. That there's so it's not the issues aren't as simple as they're being painted, and they're certainly not racial. I'm not going to deny that race can have a part, particularly around about the immigration debate. I don't think it's. I think it's culture. I think culture's far more important. And there's it comes back to the point we're talking about ECHR and how everything's changed in 20 years. So Britain's had this rapid change. Well, but then in Brexit, we've got all these new people arriving. It's too much. It's too much for a society to cope with so quickly. And that's maybe why going back to, the pre-ECHR way of British life as a foundation value, we should try and get back to. I don't know. Something's got to be better than where we are now. Where we are now is not good. Okay, we are not socially integrating. We've got problems everywhere around the country, demonstrations everywhere. This is not good. Community tensions are high. Okay, I live near a place called Falkirk. I don't know if you've heard it. It's a small Scottish town. There's regular demonstrations in it, which is bonkers. We've never had things like that in somewhere like Falkirk before. There's something going very wrong, and we need to bring the temperature down and come up with a coherent plan to do that.
You're not the first person who tells me these strange stories. I interviewed somebody from Greece, and there was some tiny little fishing village in Greece that is absolutely not the number one tourist destination in the country, which has had similar issues, which is extremely strange, to
Yes.
put it mildly. So it's clear that someone is also clearly trying to create divisions and rile up tensions even in areas where they did not exist and nobody is particularly interested.
So I suppose the question that comes off the back of that arena is, could all this be by chance? And anyone with any real suspicious mind has to go, no, right? There'll be elements of what's going on will be by chance, but that it looks to me that overall there's some sort of malign influence at play here. I agree with
So now that we see that there is a clear pattern and that there is an effort to destabilize society, all of society, not just major urban areas, not just cosmopolitan cities and university campuses and international infrastructures, but also even relatively monolithic and rural areas that are not privy to these international tensions. Clearly, there is a play being made by someone with the resources and organization and understanding of society and social psychology and what makes this each particular area tick to create this situation and to create extreme polarization on a widespread uh, scale. The question is, what do these parties stand to gain? After all, on the one hand, yes, enemies of the West want to destroy the West, but on the other hand, many of these enemies, whether they're Russia, China, Iranian elites, even North Koreans, and much less assorted Islamists from the Middle East, they enjoy the West precisely because of the stability and prosperity and non-judgmental openness that it has to offer. So what will they do if it turns into another Syria or Yemen or Lebanon, a failed state with with bankrupt societies and tribalistic mobs roaming the streets? This is why my question is a little bit: what are they actually gaining here? Aren't they shooting themselves in the foot a little bit?
you. Yes, but by the same token, if we accept that there is some sort of malign actor at work
Hmm.
here, right? Well, they're always going to be trying to pursue their own interests. So there's a difference between destabilizing countries, right? So they can't focus on you and turning them into Mad Max. Right? There's a
Hmm.
there's a difference, you know. So that
But at what point can they reasonably stop before it gets to that point?
yes,
Can they really
yeah, I
stop?
get you. I get you. You're playing with fire. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I understand, right? But it's in certain regimes' interests, I suppose, to have the West destable. That doesn't mean they want it to fall, right? So it comes back to your point. It's not that they want it destable enough that it suits their interests, because then they get to rise up in terms of their influence in the world. They get to continue their own initiatives and increase their own influence because the West is too busy tearing itself apart. But there'll be an end that right. I mean, way ahead, there will be an end point to that. There's all
Hmm.
there's an end point to that where if we accept someone is or an entity is causing this for their own ends, they get to a stage where they want to be in charge, and maybe that's when destabilization does move into Mad Max. But I think we're taking things well out with my area of expertise and way into the future. We'd be better off living with Father Ted and his wee island by this.
There's been a talk about, from Macron specifically just today, about regulating social media companies because they are the ones pushing a lot of extremist content and bots and trolls and so on and so forth. I'm not sure at this point it will do any good, but the question is, besides, yes, the social media companies create and facilitate echo chambers and you know, uh, they sort of create a polarized vision of the world and prevent people from seeing alternative content. However, let's face it, social media is not the only factor at play. It reaches many people, but how some social media is not even under British control or US control.
Mhm.
TikTok, for instance, in Europe is still the Chinese control, and unless the UK government negotiates a separate deal the way the US did, this it will continue. So not everything can be regulated, even if you want to. And aside from that, you have the politicians making remarks on stage that appear to be feeding into this general that appear to be pushing polarization. You have regular media pushing the same type of content. You have video games, private forums that are not necessarily social media, but they're still places for engagement. There's no way to control and regulate everything. It just can't happen in a decentralized society. There's no resources for that. There's, you know, NSA collects more information than it could possibly process, much less analyze. What so where do we go from here? What's the logical step towards essentially inoculating people from information that is clearly messing with their minds and clearly presenting an alternative picture of the world? Um, while at when they're adults, with the children, maybe you can teach them critical thinking skills, but what do you do with adults who are already in that mindset, who are with the current generations?
Yeah. So I think I think you hit the nail on the head with the kids, right? We need to get better at that and stop being responsive. We need to accept that social media is here, right?
Hmm.
We need to be thinking, how is this going to evolve and how is it going to affect society? Because we haven't seen that yet. We don't know how this is, how things are going to be 40 years from now because people have grown up with this and nothing else. And I think we have to be far more on the front foot with kids. I like your point about the critical thinking skills. Where I would go with that is when I was at school, we'd debate. We'd debate club where you could be asked to take on abhorrent viewpoints, right? And you had someone would oppose you. So particularly they like picking a viewpoint that you didn't agree with, and then you had to defend it, right? And you did that. I then studied philosophy, so that's where it was my first degree. So I really enjoyed that. We need to get back to that because that's how you get away from polarization. Is getting people force people to see others' point of view from a really young age and build in those critical thinking skills. Completely agree with you there. Completely and utterly agree with you. And build in that respect for other people's opinions. Okay. So you and I won't agree on everything. It doesn't mean I'm going to start calling you names and swearing at you. And that's the way society needs to be
Hmm.
because it's through disagreement and coming together and going, right, what don't we agree on and why? And then you change someone's point of view or you come to, a new opinion. And we need to get back to that because at the moment it's totally polarized. Um, I think that politicians have got a lot to do here in terms of toning down the rhetoric. I don't know, Mark Sageman, the really famous terrorism author, wrote a book about this, about the militarization of language and how that ultimately in
Hmm.
itself leads to political violence. And I think that happens with the rhetoric that politicians issue. And that the temperature needs to be lowered, right? And we need to get back to disagreeing agreeably, right? Like being pleasant to each other. I'm hoping that the tragedy with Charlie Kirk, refocuses people on on this, that someone should never be killed for expressing an opinion, in the West or anywhere in the world, but particularly in the West. That having a debate and disagreeing is fundamental to our civilization. I mean, we come from the ancient Greeks, essentially, the West. And rhetoric was the basis for the
Hmm.
whole of the Western, Western thought. And it's like we've abandoned that, it's we need to get back to that. I know it's easier said than done. All right. I know it's easier said than, but that's what we need to get back to. And we need to be back to not reacting and being polarized with each other. But at the same time, we have to stop um, we have to stop mollycoddling individuals, right? Who are saying ridiculous things. So this is, I might sound like I'm being contradictory, but I'm not, right? Most any reasonable person knows that a human being is not a cat, for instance, right? And I know that's an extreme example, right? But
Sure.
you get where I'm coming from.
Hmm.
We need to go, no, enough of this. This needs to stop, and we need to return to reality and being able to say something that's real as well, so that I'm not worried I'm going to get investigated by HR for telling you you're not a cat, Irina. We need to get back to that in society. That there's nothing wrong with me saying no, that's not happening. And you might identify as someone that doesn't like to get up until 10 o'clock in the morning to come to work. Do you know what? That doesn't matter. You'll be at your work at 9 o'clock, whether you identify as a 10 o'clock riser or not. And I'm being
Hmm.
flippant and taking it to the extreme, but that's what we need to get back to common sense and being able to speak the truth to people and returning to the reasonable person test. That was a long answer.
But speaking of the truth, we've come to a situation where some of the Jewish community members are thinking about leaving the country. We have the police telling Jews to stay indoors and close the doors to synagogues, to essentially placing the blame on them for
Yeah,
being the
yeah, I know,
victims.
I know, I know.
And this is not the first country to do that. We've seen that around Europe,
Okay,
everywhere.
but and I'll caveat that when the far right were causing issues, post 9/11, the same happened with mosques.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's not like this
But
is something that's only ever happened to the Jewish community.
no,
And then
but
if you
my
think
point
of
is
Northern
it's wrong
Ireland,
no matter who it
yeah, yeah.
happens to.
If you think of Northern Ireland, the Protestant, the Catholic communities, these things have happened, right?
But they shouldn't.
Whether no, of
The
course
no
they shouldn't.
community should be
No,
blamed for
no, no, no.
their
I
for being
completely
a
agree with you.
target.
Completely agree with you. But I don't think I probably picked you up wrong there. It's not. This is not unique to the Jewish community. It's unique
Oh,
to a community who may become victims, right?
it's correct.
Um, yeah, yeah. It should
But
never
my
be.
but my point is it's clear that instead of taking the responsibility for protecting the citizens of whoever,
Yeah,
whichever background, who are currently at the crosshairs of bigotry and assailant, the police is placing the responsibility of the community not only for self-protection, which is fine, whatever, they pay taxes, but still, if
yeah,
they want to organize, but for essentially hiding and cowering
yeah.
before a mob. That I think
No,
is
I
far more dangerous for all of society and not just for
completely
any
agree with
communication in quite it sends a message that whoever is next is going to meet the same end. Heckler's veto. It enables heckler's veto
you. Yeah.
at top level.
Jewish people should be able to live their life the exact same as any other member of the community in Britain, right? I had friends from school who were Jews, who I've not seen for a while, right? But they were good pals back in the day, and the thought that their life is in some way being limited, and that they might have to choose to leave Scotland, it's abhorrent to me. That people who've been here, their whole entire life, born here like me, may now be thinking of this. And tonight, given all, let's go back to Thursday, the demonstrations and stuff, and then demonstrations today, that they're sitting in the house scared. It's really sad. It's really, really sad that we've got to this stage.
You mentioned the very title of your book, Terror for Profit, actually
Mm-hmm.
brings me to the way to turn the tables on this whole situation. How do we make decency profitable? How do we
Mm-hmm.
change the incentive system so that it is no longer profitable to push extremism, but it is profitable to push moderation and tolerance?
Okay. Yep. So I'd probably start off with Northern Ireland. is a really
Hmm.
good example of that, right? Because that's the extreme, right? Where you still have organized criminals masquerading as terrorists preying on communities, right? So post the Good Friday Agreement, right? There's not been that push to deal with this, to really get in about communities, call out these individuals as criminals, remove that veneer of respectability they have amongst these communities because of the cause they claim to espouse, which they abandoned a long time ago. You have to lance that boil, right? So using Northern Ireland as that example, right? That needs to happen, and that needs to be driven by government. Okay, that can't be driven by the police. The police are your response agency to that, but that has to be driven by government, and there has to be a will to do it. So if we take that as our extreme example, right, that's driven by government, the right narratives out there, and you take the actions to drive that, and you get people in the jail that deserve to be in the jail. The same needs to happen in society. Round about people in the case we're speaking about here who are in any way espousing anti-Semitic beliefs. Okay, they need to be ostracized, they need to be prosecuted, and government needs to be driving that and be really clear in driving that is not tolerable in 21st century Britain. No chance. It's just not on. And you know what? It needs to reach a stage where they feel uncomfortable, perhaps, being in Britain rather than the Jewish community that lives here. That's what we need to do to get to a stage where they think, well, maybe I won't stay here anymore. Maybe I'll leave because they're the problem, not the innocent Jews who are just going about their life and are as Scottish as I am. Okay. You know,
That's a good point. And in general, even outside this particular issue, the world needs to be made safe for the law-abiding individuals, not for criminals, extremists, and so forth. They should not be the ones with the incentives. The world should not work for them. It should be exactly the opposite.
it's all about just now, it's all about rights, nothing about responsibilities. We
Hmm.
need to get back to people being
True
responsible.
individualism is very much about taking personal responsibility and bringing it into the ecosystem where you do not impede on other people's rights. Not only you
Correct.
protect your own, but you also ensure that there is a balance so that everyone can coexist and everyone's property, life, uh, personal interests, and personal creed is protected. We we're ending up in a situation where some people feel entitled to impose on others and they don't care about those people's rights. That's
Yeah.
not a way to, that's chaos. That's the first step to anarchy.
Yes. Mad Max time.
But thank you so much. This was a very fascinating conversation. I look forward to reading your book, and I strongly recommend that everyone else who wants to understand, especially from a police perspective, which I think is not nearly emphasized enough. The current predicament we're in should return for profit and think about it. Think about how we can amplify the voices for people who are fighting extremism, not contributing to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me, Irene. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.